So this is the John Batchelor Show. The attack on Gabrielle Giffords, the murder of her aide, Gabe Zimmerman, a man who was engaged to be married. He's 30 years old and he's gone. A federal judge, John Roll, murdered on his way from church, just stopped to say good day to Gabrielle Giffords. A sunny day in Tucson, Arizona. A little girl born on 9/11. 4 others. People gathered at a corner in Tucson. And now a massacre and a national nightmare. Members of Congress paying a special attention to this, not only for their own safety and the concerns of their families, but also the aides, their aides. These are young people. They work very hard all the time. They go into the field with members of Congress. What is to be done? Is there a protection? Is there protection for members of Congress? Thaddeus McCotter, who represents 11th Michigan, that's Livonia, Western Detroit, joins me tonight because it's been 2 days now, and Congress is still responding. The House of Representatives gathers again tomorrow in Washington, the 112th Congress, to address these matters. Thaddeus, good evening again. And Gabrielle Giffords is still alive. That's the good news. But Gabe Zimmerman is dead. And the question here is, what protection can be offered to members of Congress? Mr. Brady, Robert Brady, representing 1st Pennsylvania, has offered legislation that he says is necessary to make it a federal crime to threaten members of Congress. How do you respond to that, Thaddeus? Good evening.
Well, John, you do not want the actions of a lunatic who has already taken human life, shaken so many lives, to infringe our constitutional rights and to impair our innate faith in the America that we've inherited. So when I look at this, I can understand why people in Congress may be upset. But the reality is you have to have a clear, sober assessment of it. And you have to have an assessment of it that you do not want the government to overreact and start to infringe upon people's constitutional rights because of what some lunatic did. Some lunatic who, by his own admission, thought that grammar was being used for mind control by the government.
Right.
This does not sound like someone who paid much attention to heated rhetoric. It sounds like what it is, in my lay opinion, it sounds like a very unbalanced mind. And I don't think that we should become unhinged by his actions to the point where we make matters worse than they already are.
I'm told that the Sergeant-at-Arms of the House of Representatives, Mr. Livingood, was on a conference call with several hundred members of Congress, their families, staffers, their families, over these last hours, discussing what is to be done, are there any measures available. It doesn't come to one thing right now, but the suggestion is conversation with liaison with police authorities in districts in some fashion to make to have a conversation. I don't know. It didn't come to anything I can say. Do you think that's a good direction to follow, to bring in law enforcement to assess these street events or meeting the constituents when you have staffers with you?
Well, John, let's look. I hate to be brutally honest about this, but since 9/11, we know that there are people intent upon killing Americans. Intent upon killing Americans of all walks of life. And so that has been a consideration since September 11th, 2001. And so when you start talking about lunatics running around as well, what are you going to do to make yourself 100% safe? You can't. You just take reasonable, prudent precautions. And that's all you can really ever do, whether you're a member of Congress, a senator, or a senior citizen going to the grocery store, or someone who lives in a rough part of town. There's only so much you can do. And one of the things that I'm heartened by watching is my colleagues saying that the last thing they want to come out of this is to put up barriers between the members of the public that they work for and themselves, because they understand that personal interaction and engagement with one's employers, their constituents, has to continue and is needed more than ever right now. And so I think that what you're going to see is a lot of concern, which is appropriate. You're going to see people start to think about how to reasonably and prudently protect themselves. But I also think they're going to refrain from putting up obstacles for the interaction between members and their constituents.
Something surprising and sad I've learned through this, this is Thaddeus McCotter, a member of Congress from Michigan, is that threats and inappropriate language and activity by constituents towards members of Congress is not rare. In fact, it's a part of the life of being a member of Congress. Elliot Engel, your colleague from New York, tells me that even after speeches on the floor of Congress that appear on C-SPAN, there are threats issued. It's a surprise to all of us because, as I understand, you members of Congress have decided not to report everything or not to make a big issue of it. Is it time to make an issue of these threats, that is, at least to inhibit those who talk cheaply and make and throw remarks on the telephone?
Well, as you remember, John, when we were going through the Sergeant Crowley affair, the beer summit, I supported Sergeant Crowley, and I think that we've received some of the most vicious, vitriolic calls from the left that I've ever seen. And yet, you understand that that's their right to free speech. Now, you may not like the way they express themselves, and you shut it out. My concern remains this. The place to determine where overheated political rhetoric, what constitutes overheated political rhetoric and what is to be done about it belongs in the public square, not in Congress passing legislation that infringes free speech or in the hands of pundits who will use it for political purposes. The public can look at what people say, how they say it, and make their determination as to whether that's worthy of being supported or whether it's being worthy of rejection. We have to put our faith in the public on this. Now, when somebody calls your office, you have, over time, as I'm sure Elliot has, you can tell when somebody's blowing off steam or when somebody constitutes a threat. And I think the members will make their own determinations as to what they do. The last thing you want to do is that everybody who ever writes in with something horrible or nasty is then put through a system, and then it gets out, and then you encourage more people to do it because it gets them attention and it looks as if it may have swayed the member. So every member's going to have to deal with that. There's discretion on their part. And ultimately, John, I go back to it's the public square where the determination of what constitutes too intense free speech has to be made in a voluntary way amongst the American people.
The facts of the shooter do not support the political excitement right now, Thaddeus. It seems to have left planet Earth and be off on its own its own orbit here about the left and the right and people blame shifting here. How to hear this? How to hear this excited language trying to fault, say, a significant political actor, Sarah Palin?
Well, I think it's ridiculous. Look, I was on a DCCC quote-unquote targets map myself back in 2009. And, the political vernacular is a very rough vernacular. Maybe that changes. Maybe it doesn't. But what they're trying to do, look, I grew up. One of my heroes was John Lennon. He was shot by a man who was reading Catcher in the Rye that thought John Lennon was an imposter and that he himself was the real one, and that's why he shot him in front of the Dakota. Now, he was reading Catcher in the Rye. Do I blame J.D. Salinger for this? No. Do you blame anybody for the actions of a lunatic but the lunatic? No, and you shouldn't. And for those people who are pointing fingers, their time's better spent doing something like praying. Because what's going to happen is those who want to seek to get partisan political advantage out of this are going to be seen by the American people as completely, utterly despicable and irresponsible.
Thaddeus McCotter, 11th Michigan, Catcher in the Rye. It's a very good book, and J.D. Salinger was a genius author of the 20th century. It was not on the reading list associated with the shooter, who was a sad, troubled, broken young man. I'm